lecture series for Introduction to Philosophy. This video will conclude our discussion of cosmological arguments for the existence of God. You will remember that in our previous video we discussed one version of the cosmological argument made famous, at least in a contemporary context, by the philosopher William Lane Craig, and that argument is called the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Now, one virtue of the argument is that its structure is quite simple. You'll remember the structure we gave last time. It has two premises and just a single conclusion. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. Then, premise 2, the universe began to exist, and so that means the universe must have had a cause of its existence. And the reason this is significant is because if you say that the universe as a whole had a cause of its existence, then we seem to be talking about something outside of the universe itself. This seems to be very much akin to what Aquinas, in his version of the cosmological argument, had called the first cause. And in this case, what the Kalam cosmological argument identifies is the first cause of the beginning of the universe itself, an answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Why does the universe exist when it didn't have to? And so the argument posits this first cause. Now, of course, the questions that we still have about this first cause, well, the most general and the biggest question is this first cause God? Of course, I would suggest to you that no argument for the existence of God will be able to give you everything you might want in proving that God exists, right? The argument will only take you so far. So perhaps a better question is, to what extent can we know that this first cause is at least a good candidate to be God? That it's at least somewhat God-like, that it seems to have some properties of God? And I suggested to you there are a few things that we can know about this first cause. So one thing we know is that the first cause is not the universe itself, because the argument already establishes in the second premise of the argument that the universe must have had a cause. So whatever the first cause is, it isn't the universe. This is what Bertrand Russell, again you'll recall, sort of suggested when he said, the universe is there and that's all. Russell wanted to say, well, the universe itself is this necessary being that provides all the explanation we need. No, the cosmological argument will say that, in fact, there must have been something outside the universe, independent of the universe, which explains why the universe exists. So the first cause is not the universe itself. Also, we know the first cause is uncaused, right? It's tempting to ask the question, well, what caused the first cause? Well, nothing. If there was something else that caused the first cause, then the first cause wouldn't in fact be the first cause. And so the whole idea of the argument is that at some point there has to be this first entity that brought the universe into existence. And so for that reason, we shouldn't say the first cause was caused by something else. We should say the first cause is uncaused. It was eternal. It always existed. So we said we can know those few things about this first cause. And you might say, well, let's say that's true. We have an uncaused thing that is outside the universe. I mean, that is very much a unique being, but why think that that is necessarily God? Well, one of the things Craig does, he says, well, if we continue on this line of reasoning, we should be able to see there's other things we can know about the first cause as well. So, for instance, we've already established the first cause is uncaused. And this means it must be beginningless, right? Because if it doesn't have a cause, that means it can't have a beginning. Everything that is caused to come into existence has a beginning of its existence. So not only is the first cause not the universe, it's uncaused and it's beginningless. Okay, definitely a unique being. Is it God? Not quite yet. But also he says we should notice that the first cause is also changeless. Or the terminology we used when we looked at Plato's Phaedo, the first cause is immutable. Now, why is this? This is because if the first cause could undergo change, then those changes would need to be caused. So think about this idea. If you say the first cause is something that can change from one state to another, that can grow larger or smaller or change colors or whatever sort of change you want to imagine. If you imagine the first cause can undergo all those sorts of changes, well, based on what the arguments told us, all of those changes would need a cause themselves. But we've already said that the first cause is uncaused. We've already said that's the case. And so that means the first cause cannot change. If all changes need some cause to explain that change, and the first cause is completely uncaused, it must not only exist forever and be eternal, but also be immutable. It must also be changeless. And that itself is certainly something that's much different. It's a property that we really don't see in any other entity that we come across in our daily lives. And Craig thinks not only can we say the first cause is changeless, it also must be immaterial. And this is where really we start to see, wow, this first cause must be very different, very unique from the normal sorts of material entities that we encounter. Now, why is the first cause immaterial? And what does that mean? It just means non-physical, you might even say supernatural, but just not of the physical world. Now, why does he say this? This is because whatever is material involves incessant change on at least the molecular and atomic levels. So for instance, if you look at a table just sitting right in front of you, as I am right now, the table to our naked eye doesn't appear to be moving, no one's pushing it, it's not falling off a building, it's just sitting right in front of you. But of course, to some extent that is an illusion because it's undergoing tons of change. At its molecular and atomic and subatomic levels, there's all sorts of very small particles that are bouncing around and moving all over the place. And this is the case for all material, all physical beings. Based on what we know about the physical world, all physical and all material beings, although to our eye are not undergoing change, if they're just sitting there, are undergoing constant motion and constant change. So if we're going to say that the first cause experiences no change, that means it also cannot be a material thing. It cannot be a physical thing. And at this point now we start to see why Craig thinks we have good reason to think this first cause might be something which sounds very much like God. Because God is not said to be a physical thing, God is said to be supernatural, God is said to be divine, God is said to be immaterial. And now we have a reason to think that the first cause that that Craig thinks he has proven to exist is also immaterial, non-physical, supernatural. And he says we can also know a further fact about the first cause which suggests even more its uniqueness and closeness to God. He says the first cause is timeless and spaceless. Now what does this mean? The first cause exists outside of time and it exists outside of space. And this is a very hard conception to wrap our minds around because the human mind, I think, very much is set up to think within the categories of time and space. Whenever we think of an object, we think of it existing at a certain time or for a certain period of time as taking up a certain amount of space at a certain location. So it's very hard to us even imagine what it would mean to exist outside of space and time. It's one reason why, if you remember in Plato's Phaedo, when we talked about Plato's theory of the forms, it's very hard for us to imagine or understand what it would mean for the forms to exist out of space and time. But although it might be difficult for us to comprehend this, Craig thinks we have good reason to think that this first cause does exist outside of space and time. Now, why is this? Well, this is because the first cause exists prior to the universe, and it is only with the origin of the universe that space and time come into existence. Now, you'll see again that the word prior is again not appropriate. It just shows how difficult it is to speak to one another without the categories of space and time. But the idea is that the first cause is independent of the universe. The first cause is not something within the universe. It's independent, it's outside of it. But we've also seen as we talked about last time, the theory of the Big Bang. According to Big Bang theory, space and time in the universe itself only come into existence after the Big Bang has occurred. Without the Big Bang, there is no space, there is no time. So if there was a sort of entity or being that existed independent of the universe, that means it also exists independent of space and time. And so that means that whatever this first cause is, it exists outside of space, outside of time. Again, a sort of conception that is very common to traditional notions of God. God is said not to being another being in the world. It's not a being you can run up into in your daily life or look up his address and go to his house. No, God is seen to be a being that is responsible for the creation of the universe, but not of the universe. A being that's outside of space and time. So with all these various properties, what Craig wants to show us is that, in fact, if we just think about what it means to have a first cause that is uncaused and exists independent of the universe, then we can see it may actually be much closer to God than we might actually have thought. But of course, there's still one other point here that might be missing. Because if we think of God in another way, specifically in the way that God is often talked about in many religious traditions and outside of just sort of abstract philosophical debate, to some extent God is seen as a person. Many people will talk about God as the sort of being that could conceivably answer prayers or listen to prayers. God is a being that loves about us or cares about us. God is a being that intentionally created the universe for whatever reason. And so to fully make the case that this first cause is in fact God, maybe it's not enough just to say that the first cause is uncaused, without beginning, without change, non-physical or immaterial, and outside of space and time. Maybe that's not enough. Maybe we also want to ask, is there any reason to think that the first cause is a person? You may have heard the phrase before, a personal God, and this just means a God that's not just there in an abstract sense, but has the sort of characteristics of a person to some extent. And so you are a person, of course, and so think about the characteristics that make you unique from other sorts of beings. And you can probably come up with a number of them. First, you have mental states, right? You have an intellect. You also have a will. You can make decisions, and we think you can make those decisions freely. Whereas other things in the world just act, right? So, a tree just grows based on its internal biology. There's no real choice in the matter. You can decide whether to, what you want to have for lunch, where you want to go to school, what sort of job you want to have, right? You can make all these decisions, and we think you do so on the basis of your will and perhaps even a free will. And when you're making those free choices, we think that you're acting intentionally. Right, so when you go out to a restaurant to have lunch, you're saying, I am intending to go to this place at this specific time for this reason, namely to satiate my hunger. And so sort of characteristic or hallmarked aspect of a person is that it acts intentionally, it acts for a reason. And so we might wonder, well, okay, is this first cause just some sort of abstract, non-physical entity that caused the universe to exist? Or is it an abstract, non-physical entity that didn't just cause the universe, but intentionally created the universe, and perhaps intentionally created the universe for some specific reason? To fully make the case that this first cause is in fact God, and not just some strange entity that we don't run into in our daily lives, but is actually what we're talking about when we normally talk about God, Craig will want to give us some reasons to think that the first cause is a person. And in fact, he does just this, and I'm going to call the argument he gives here the personal explanation argument. Okay, so the argument's relatively simple in structure. Once again, P1, the first cause either provides a scientific explanation of the beginning of the universe, or it provides a personal explanation of the beginning of the universe, and consequently is a person. So what P1 does is first it notices that what the first cause is supposed to do is it is supposed to explain why the universe exists. Right? So the first cause somehow brought the universe into existence and therefore is the explanation of its existence. But then we can ask the question, well, what kind of explanation does it give? And Craig says there's really two types of explanation that we give to various events in our experience. He says one kind of explanation we give is what he would call a scientific explanation. And so a scientific explanation for some event is given in terms of physical laws and initial conditions. So let's say, for instance, you see an apple fall from a tree and you want to know, okay, I want to explain this event. Why did the apple fall from the tree? Okay, well, you might give an explanation in terms of various physical causes. such as gravitational constants and other physical laws of nature that would explain the velocity and the speed at which the apple fell to the ground. Right? You could do that whole thing. Right? If you were a physicist, you could get in great granular detail, giving a scientific explanation in terms of the physical laws of the universe, why that apple fell, and why it fell in the way it did. But there's also other sorts of explanations we give. And many times we give scientific explanations, but sometimes we give what Craig calls a personal explanation. A personal explanation for some event is given in terms of agents and their volitions. So what's an agent? It just means like a person who is engaging in action and choice. And what is a volition? It just means an act of your will, or you can think about it as a desire. So sometimes we say, here's what happened, and here's a scientific explanation why. Other times we say, here's what happened, and here's a personal explanation why. It happened because this person wanted it to happen. It happened because this person chose for it to happen. So the first premise just says that there are these two different kinds of explanation. Now to further understand these two sort of explanations, let's look at a specific example. So here's the one Craig uses. He says, well, for example, consider the question, why is the kettle boiling? Right? So let's say there is a teapot that's boiling and it's whistling, it's ready to be taken off the heat, and you say, why is the kettle boiling? Well, you could give two types of explanation to that question. Let's first examine what a scientific explanation would look like. You would be told, look, the heat of the flame is being conducted via the copper bottom of the kettle to the water, increasing the kinetic energy of the water molecules such that they vibrate so violently that they break the surface tension of the water and are thrown off in the form of steam. So notice this explanation is given in terms of, here are the physical components of the world, here are some facts we know about energy, here are some facts we know about the physical laws of nature. Right? It's a scientific explanation of why the kettle is boiling. And it's a perfectly legitimate explanation to give. But notice, if someone told you, if you asked why is the kettle boiling, and they gave you that explanation, you might legitimately ask, okay, yeah, I accept all that, but I wasn't really interested in the science behind why the kettle's boiling. I just want to know, like, why is the kettle boiling when it didn't have to be? Why was the choice made to put those events into motion which brought the kettle about to a boiling state? And here what you might be asking for is a personal explanation. Alternatively, Craig says, we might be told, I put it on to make a cup of tea, would you like some? Right, when you're asking the other question, you might say, look, I accept all the science and I understand how kinetic energy works and how it conducts energy to make the water boil, but I'm really asking, like, why did you want the water to boil in the first place? And when you're asking about what someone wants, you're asking about their desires. You're asking about why did they make certain choices. You're asking about their will. And that's why the answer you'd be looking for is something like, I put it on to make a cup of tea. The person is identifying what they want, a cup of tea, and saying that's the reason why the kettle is boiling right now. So first thing to notice that in general, Craig isn't saying that either of these is superior. He's saying that in some contexts one makes sense, in some contexts the other makes sense. Right now he's just saying there are these two types of explanation, and we use these sorts of explanation all the time. Now the reason this matters is because take a look at P2 of the personal explanation argument. We have the two types of explanation, and the second premise says, the first cause cannot provide a scientific explanation of the beginning of the universe. Now, before I explain why that is, notice what we must conclude from that. If there's two kinds of explanation, scientific and personal, and if the first cause cannot provide a scientific explanation of the beginning of the universe, then the conclusion follows that the first cause must provide a personal explanation of the universe, and consequently, the first cause must be a person. So by process of elimination, Craig thinks if he can show the first cause cannot provide a scientific explanation, then by process of elimination, it must provide a personal explanation. So the question is, why doesn't he think that the first cause can provide a scientific explanation of the universe? Craig gives the following explanation. He says, each explanation is a perfectly legitimate form of explanation. Indeed, in certain contexts, it would be wholly inappropriate to give one rather than the other. Now, a first state of the universe cannot have a scientific explanation, since there is nothing before it, and therefore it cannot be accounted for in terms of laws operating on initial conditions. It can only be accounted for in terms of an agent and his volitions, a personal explanation. So think about the nature of scientific explanations. Think about the scientific explanation of why the apple fell from the tree. Think about the scientific explanation of why the kettle was boiling. All of those explanations are given in terms of, or given in terms that require space and time. We say, well, the apple fell a certain distance from the tree, and it did it at this velocity, given these fundamental physical laws and what we know about gravity. All of that is only possible. The only reason we can have physical laws, the only reason we can explain those physical laws or use them to explain anything, is because we live in a universe with space and time. And this means that scientific explanations are only possible within space and time. If there was no space, there was no time, we couldn't talk about the distance the apple fell, we couldn't talk about how long it took to fall, we couldn't talk about the speed at which it fell. And the same goes for the kettle boiling, the same goes for anything you want to explain in scientific terms, in terms of physical laws. So science requires space and time. But wait a minute, we already saw that according to the Big Bang Theory, according to standard knowledge about what it means for the universe to come into existence, before the Big Bang, before the universe came into existence, there was no space and time. We just said earlier that the first cause, because it's independent of the universe, exists outside of space and time. But if the universe exists, if the first cause exists outside of space and time, then a scientific explanation is not possible. We can't give a scientific explanation of how the first cause brought the universe into existence, because without space and without time, there are no physical laws, and no explanation of that sort will work. So what are we left with? Well, we're still saying the first cause explains the universe, so that means it must do so in personal terms. Craig thinks the only way we can explain how the first cause brings the universe about is by thinking about the desire, will, and volition of the first cause. Now, there'll be a lot of detail that's left out, but at minimum, Craig thinks we have to say something like the following. The universe exists, the first cause brought about the universe because the first cause wanted the universe to exist, because the first cause chose for the universe to exist, because the first cause intended for the universe to exist. Just like the person intended to make the kettle boil so they could have some tea, the first cause intended to bring about the universe for, well, whatever reason that we can deem that the first cause had for wanting the universe to exist. And if that's true, if the first cause can only provide a personal explanation of the universe, then it seems the first cause must be a person, or at least a person-like entity. It must have a will, it must be able to make choices, it would have to have desires and preferences, and specifically we would at least know a desire that the universe exists rather than it not exist. And of course, this brings us back to the very question we began with when we ask, why is there something rather than nothing? Well, for Craig, the answer has to be there's something rather than nothing, because this first cause, what he thinks is God, wanted there to be something rather than nothing and chose for there to be something rather than nothing. Now, to conclude this video, I want to consider one important objection to Craig's argument. We've seen the argument is quite straightforward and quite powerful, and it might get us closer to God than it might initially seem that we could get from just the idea that the universe has a first cause. But I want to return to the second premise of that argument for a second. Remember, the second premise says the universe began to exist. And remember why Craig thinks the universe began to exist. We talked about this in our last video. The universe must have had a beginning because the universe cannot be infinite. The universe cannot be an infinite chain of events. And why can't the universe be an infinite chain of events? Well, because infinity is conceptually incoherent for things that actually exist. Just like you couldn't have Hilbert's Hotel, an infinite hotel with infinite guests, so you couldn't have an infinite universe with infinite moments of time. That's the idea that Craig puts forward. But we might notice here that maybe this is in tension somewhat with traditional conceptions of God. On traditional conceptions of God, God is not just eternal, God is not just without beginning, but God is also unlimited. In fact, on some conceptions, it's common to say that God is even infinite. And we might wonder here, well, wait a minute, is this a double standard? Why is it the case that the universe can't be infinite, but God can? Now, to spell out this objection, the first thing I should do is explain a little further what I mean by this idea that God is infinite. So there's a number of ways you could spell this out, right? If you think about God's properties, omnibenevolence, you might say God has infinite goodness, or omnipotence, God has infinite power, or God is omniscient, God has infinite knowledge. And I think the easiest way to see this is let's just think about omniscience. Let's just think about the property that God is said to have, that God knows everything. And more specifically, if we say that God is omniscient, what are we saying about God? Well, according to one definition, if a being is omniscient, then that being knows every true proposition. So all that means is an omniscient being, for every single true sentence, every true statement that exists, that being would know that that sentence or statement is true. So that means God, in fact, would know every single true proposition. That means that God knows who won the Revolutionary War, God knows who the President of the United States is, God knows what color grass is, etc. Every single true proposition, God knows that it's true. Now, to illustrate what it would mean, why this is related to infinity, let's consider mathematical knowledge. And consider two propositions. Proposition 1. Every even number can be evenly divided by 2. Okay, now we all know this is true, so certainly God knows it's true as well. Consider proposition 2. Every odd number cannot be evenly divided by 2. Same thing here, relatively straightforward. We all know that's true, so it would be very odd if an omniscient being like God didn't know it's true. So God must know, if God is omniscient, God must know that proposition 1 is true and proposition 2 is true. But what follows from those propositions? Well, if God knows that every even number can be evenly divided by 2, then God must know that 2 can be divided by 2, and 4 can be divided by 2, and 6 can be divided by 2, and 8 can be divided by 2, and I could go on and on for how long? For infinity. So that means if God knows that every even number can be evenly divided by 2, then God knows an infinite number, right? An infinite number of true propositions. And the same with the other proposition. If God knows that every odd number cannot be evenly divided by 2, then God also knows an infinite number of propositions. God knows that 1 can't be evenly divided by 2, and 3 can't be divided by 2, and 5, and 7, and 9, 11, etc. on to infinity. So the first point I'm trying to make is that if God has knowledge of every true proposition, then God's knowledge of mathematical propositions, for instance, implies that God has infinite number of propositions within God's mind or within God's intellect. And we might think, well, if what Craig said about infinity before is right, then this could be a problem. Because we saw Craig argue previously that an infinite number of things generates all sorts of strange paradoxes that are impossible and absurd. So for instance, let's do the same infinity addition paradox that we did previously. Take the even set, right? Take that set of propositions which can all be divided by 2 that God knows, an infinite set. Add to it the odd set. Take that set of propositions that God knows can't, the numbers that cannot be evenly divided by 2, also an infinite set. If you add all the propositions in the odd set to all the propositions in the even set, once again, as we said before, you're left with nothing more than what you started with. You're still left with the even set. Because infinity plus infinity is, of course, infinity. And this is just one illustration, right? If it really is the case that an infinite number of things that exist will always generate paradoxes and absurdities, then an infinite number of things existing in God's mind should also generate those same paradoxes and those same absurdities. And ultimately what this shows is that one major worry for the cosmological argument is that it runs the risk of generating two different kinds of double standards. On the one hand, we can ask the question that we've really been hitting throughout all these videos. Why is it okay for God to be uncaused and not acceptable for the universe to be uncaused? Right? Why is it the case that the universe can't be an uncaused thing, that the universe can't be a necessary being, but God can be uncaused, God can be necessary? Now, of course, what Craig says is, well, it's because the universe itself can't be infinite. It has to have a beginning based on all the paradoxes of infinity that he's discussed. But that just brings up another double standard, the one that we just introduced. Why is it acceptable for God to be infinite, but not acceptable for the universe itself to be infinite? For us to find this argument wholly satisfactory, we will need some sort of response to those double standards. For instance, you would need some sort of claim that the sense in which the propositions exist in God's mind is not the same as the paradoxes that Craig created with an infinite number of moments of time in the universe. Perhaps there is some response like that available. I will leave it to you to think about this more carefully and for us to further discuss. But for the moment, I will cut this video there. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.